So I'm starting the recording now. So when we get to the Talmudic period, and I just get the question from Aaron, thinking the Stamaim and the Savoraim edited the current text, the text of the Talmud as we have it today. It is hard to tell to what extent, because since the Talmud was in the oral form until much later, we don't know when and where were things added. And here, I must say, of course, there are different opinions. One of the great scholars in this field is David Weiss-Halivni. Another one was my professor in Bar Ilan, Professor Semikha Feldblum, who studied under Avram Weiss in turn. And you also have Professor Jose Faul, who has his own way. Rabbi Faul believes that the Talmud was edited very carefully, very meticulously, and he has a theory of what he called the Sugya Mishuleshet, that the Sugya is divided into each discussion in the Talmud is divided into 3 layers. On the other hand, if like my professor, Professor Feldblum, who initiated a system called Shitat HaRevadim, which we'll talk about, was able to show that there are certain sugyot where there was no editing, or that the editing did not follow a certain plan. Rather, there are certain we could call them prefab questions that you would ask on any given sugya. We are able to identify these additions by the language, meaning you will see a transition within the sugya from the Hebrew to the Aramaic and back and forth. Maybe we'll pull up one example. Let them go to Sefaria. 1 second. So let's take an example. Aaron, to your question of what happens within the Talmudic sugya and when the Savorim add stuff. So the Gemara says that the Mishnah says the following: Ezoi dat Yehudit yotza verosha parua. A woman who transgresses what is called dat Yehudit, the laws of Jewish women, is that woman who goes out to the marketplace with her hair disheveled. They translated here uncovered, but it's not the correct translation. The correct translation of parua is disheveled. So here we have this statement: Rosha parua deoraitahi. The prohibition against a woman going out with her hair disheveled is a biblical law. Now, who said that? Who says this statement, this question? We don't have a name. That is called Sugyat Talmud. The Talmud is asking, but someone must have asked the question. So the question is asked in a way of almost like someone who interrupts in the middle of a sentence, before you finish the sentence, because this whole thing. If you look at the Mishnah, there are 4 things that the Mishnah mentions that makes a woman a transgressor of that Yehudit. Rosha parua, tova bashuk, medaberet im kol adam. She weaves in the marketplace. She talks to everyone, and they are connected. They are not separate issues. But before you even have time to finish the sentence, the Stamaim, or those anonymous editors come in and say, Rosha parua doratai, why are you telling me that it's only a practice of Jewish women when, as a matter of fact, it is a biblical prohibition? How do I know that it is a biblical prohibition? Dichtiv ufarat rosh haisha, because it is written, the Kohen will dishevel the head of the woman. V'tana devei Rabbi Ishmael, and Rabbi Ishmael says on that, Azara livnot Yisrael shelo yetzu befurua rosh deoraita. And the Tana from the school of Rabbi Ishmael, which we'll talk about more when we go back to Midrash Halacha, says that this is a warning to Jewish women to not go out beferua rosh. Sorry, not the that's here. This should be a period. Beferua rosh. So they're not allowed to go out with their head. You see, that women must generally cover head. The Gemara explains, Deoraita, by Torah law, kalta shapir dami, that Yehudit afilu kalta nami asur. So, the answer of the Talmud to that is this. The biblical prohibition, which Rabbi Shmuel mentioned, is for disheveled hair. And I'm giving you my translation, and we can see the articles that support that, because it doesn't work with this translation. So the Talmud says, disheveled hair is forbidden biblically, but if it is covered with a basket or braided into something that will serve as a base for the basket, as women used to do at the time, it will be okay. But the practice of Jewish women is to say that even that is forbidden. Only after we have, and I invite you to look later on in this sugya in Ktubot, and I will check with my friend Yehuda Ilan. He wrote an article analyzing that. If it's okay to share with you, I'll share it. If you go and look at the sugya, you realize that we have a statement from the Mishnah. Immediately after the statement from the Mishnah, there's an anonymous text. We don't know who says it. And only after that, after speaking about kalta, this basket that came out of nowhere, we have Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yohanan, kalta en ba mishum perua rosh. Rabbi Asi, in the name of Rabbi Yohanan, said that it is not a problem to wear a kalta, whatever that may be. So we already all of a sudden we move to an amora with whose name is known, and so on. It goes within the sugya. Each person that speaks here comes from a different period. So it's not a discussion of rabbis who sit together in the Beit Midrash. Just here we have anonymous text. Rabbi Asi, Rabbi Yohanan. Rabbi Yohanan is the first generation of Amoraim. Rabbi Zera is the second generation. Abai is the third generation. Then we go back to Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, who's the second and third generation. So we go back and forth between the rabbis. Obviously, this is not something that is a live session that is recorded in the Beit Midrash, and that's just one example of the anonymous stuff that was added to the Talmud. And this kind of addition is interwoven into the Talmudic text, meaning there was already a text that was transmitted orally, and the next generation of rabbis came, and as they were studying it, they added questions and discussions. Then we have another example, that of sermons that were meant for we could call it for the masses, and were incorporated into the Talmud. And this is something that is confirmed by some of the Rishonim, such as Ramban, Nachmanides, and others, Ba'alat Tosafot, and they would say they identified some of these texts as just being decorations and not part of the Talmudic Sugya. So I'll give you one example here. You know what? Not from Pesachim. I'll give you an example from Kiddushin. Remember that we studied this Mishnah. We went briefly over this Mishnah, right? So the first Mishnah of the first chapter of Kiddushin speaks about how a woman is acquired. The first Mishnah of the second chapter of Kiddushin speaks about how a man sanctifies, Haish Mekadesh. The Talmud asks the following question: Aisha niknet. Why are we using the term acquired regarding a woman and the term sanctify regarding a man? The answer of the Talmud is Mishum de Kaba'e lemitne kesef. Because one of the forms that a woman is acquired by is money. So for money, it is appropriate to use the word nikna. But then the Talmud says, "V'chesef menalan." How do we know that a woman is acquired by money? Gamal kiha mizdeh Ephron. They learned it is derived by means of a verbal analogy between the term expressing taking stated with regard to betrothal and from the term expressing taking with regard to the field of Ephron. In Deuteronomy it says when a man takes a woman, and in Genesis it says I gave the money of the field, take it from me. And we know that this kind of taking is called acquiring or acquisition, because regarding that field of Ephron, it says the field which Abraham acquired. And also it is written in Jeremiah, fields shall be acquired with money. For that reason, we wrote in the Mishnah, Ha'isha niknet. Do you see the flaws, the problems with this whole logical argument? Why is it really not logical? So, in the yeshivot, a lot of time is spent on this sugya and on the following sugyot, following discussions in the Talmud. I want to show you just one minor flaw here. In Deuteronomy, when it speaks about the man taking a woman, right? That the Talmud wants to prove that it's called acquisition. It says ki yikach ish isha. The one who takes is the buyer, right? The man is the buyer, according to the term. I'm not saying that this is how it is. I know that we have among the listeners men and women. I don't want anyone to be offended. That's not how I think, but this is the mentality of how the rabbis are speaking here, right? So the man is the buyer, the woman is the one who's being bought, so to speak, right? And who is the one to whom the verb to take is applied? The buyer, right? Ki yikach ish. Isha, he is the one who takes, and he takes the woman. But the analogy that is used, Abraham says, I gave the money for the field, take it from me. So Abraham is the buyer, and he gives the money to Ephron, and Ephron, the seller, is the one who takes it. So in this phrase, ki yikach ish isha, the buyer takes the acquired object, the woman. And in this verse, which is supposed to teach us about taking, it says, I gave the money of the field, take it from me. So it is the seller who takes the money from the buyer, and it never says in the text that the field was taken. It should have been written, Asadeh asher lakach Avraham, or Sadot bakesef yilakehu. They shall be taken with money. So there's no proof here. This whole argument has no basis. But if we know, as we know, that we looked at the structure of Perek Aleph and Perek Bet, and we know that the first chapter is a I want to see if the first chapter speaks about acquisitions, going from women to slaves to animals to real estate, and the second chapter is about kiddushin. Then we know that the question doesn't even, as they say, doesn't even start. This sugya goes on to another question. V'nidne hatam ha'ish koneh. So if you say that the appropriate term for kiddushin is kinyan, acquisition, so all you've done so far is tell me why the first Mishnah of the first chapter says Ha'isha niknet, a woman is acquired, but you didn't tell me why the difference between the first and the second chapter, Ha'isha niknet v'Ha'isha mekadesh. So they say v'nitnei atam ha'ish koneh. Let us write over there ha'ish koneh. So the Gemara, the the Talmud sort of answers, "Mi'ikara tane lishna deoraita, ulvasof tane lishna derabanan." No, it was deliberate. The author of the Mishnah first started with the biblical language and then used the rabbinical language, sort of to give equal space for everyone. Umay lishna derabanan, de'asar la'akuli alma dehekdesh. And why is it the language of the rabbis? Because she becomes forbidden for the whole world, the same as hekdesh. Which, just as a side comment, is interesting because the rabbis did not view, at least here, the term kiddushin as I sanctify you, but rather I segregate you from the rest of the world. And then the Gemara, the Talmud, comes up with different options. So why don't you write Ha'ish koneh u'makneh? You should have written here Ha'ish koneh u'makneh. The man acquires and make her acquire herself. The Gemara explains why not. Now here's the really interesting discussion, and I don't know if you did it in yeshiva or not. I did it in yeshiva, and really, I think even the time didn't make sense to me. Umay irya detane shalosh litne shlosha. The Talmud asks, why do you write in the Mishnah Ha'isha niknet? Go back to the Mishnah. See, Ha'isha niknet b'shalosh drachim. What is the question? Why shalosh? Shalosh is the feminine form in Hebrew, right? And derech is feminine, so it's appropriate to say shalosh drachim and not shlosha. What is the question? So let's go back here. See the question. Umay irya detane shalosh litne shlosha. Why does it say shalosh in the feminine and not shalosha in the masculine? And the answer is the Mishnah uses this form because it wants to teach the word way. Derech, and derech is feminine, and a pasuk here is brought, right? So I want to show you that even the way that the answer is formulated shows us, I would say, redundancy, but language that doesn't really belong here. The words mishum deka ba'ile mitnei derech, because he wanted to say the word derech. This is just a longer way to say because derech is feminine. That's what he should have said, not because he was about to say the word derech. You don't have to say that. That shows us that there's a deliberate effort here to make the text longer than it is. However, after this, the Talmud says, what about this Mishnah? B'shiv'a drachim botkin et hazav. There's a place where the Mishnah uses the term, the masculine, when it speaks about the 7 ways to examine whether one has ziva, which is some sort of a sexually transmitted disease. So the Gemara says, because he was about to say the word derech, and I know that derech is masculine because we have this verse, and then they say, so the verses contradict each other, the Mishnayot contradict each other, and there's a whole, this goes on and on and on about the gender of the word derech, whether it's masculine or feminine, and the Gemara or the Talmud basically wants to show that, I'm going back here, I'm stopping this chair, the Talmud basically wants to show that derech could be masculine and derech could be feminine, and the Mishnah uses masculine, since the word derech is sort of ambiguous, so the Mishnah would use the masculine when it speaks about masculine objects or concepts, and it will speak about in the feminine where it speaks about feminine concepts or objects. Now, I invite you again, go and analyze this sugya and see that it does not hold water. It is not logical. It does not make sense. And the right answer probably would be why the Mishnah used Shiva Drachim there and Shalosh Drachim here, because different people authored it, and because the term Shiv'a Drachim is already mentioned in the Torah, so that was taken as a unit and built into the Mishnah, whereas Shalosh Drachim, the Tana followed the regular gender. However, what Ramban says about this whole discussion and is that it's not part of the Talmud at all. Some argue that it comes not from the time of the Savoraim, who lived between the 5th and 7th century, but from an even later time, from the time of the Geonim, maybe could be 7th, 8th, 9th century, not clear. And it comes from a very specific situation. There were 2 months a year called Yarhe Kala. It was the month of Tishrei and the month of Nisan, where people from all over Babylonia would gather in around the yeshivot of Bavel, Pumbedita, Sura, Nardea, each in its time, and would study, would hear the lectures from the rabbis. And not all of them were capable of understanding the deep discussion of the Talmud. So the rabbis created for them this kind of mental gymnastics that were not so deep, that were sort of midrash halacha. They are based on the pasuk. They are entertaining. They are, even though maybe for people who are not used to the text, it looks very complicated. For people who used to hear this kind of lectures on a more regular basis, that was the kind of thing that pleased them. So I went a little bit here on a limb on your question, Aaron, but I think it's important to understand that if you to fully be able to understand the Sugya of Gemara and look at all the historical aspects, it takes. I mean, one has to, I would say, study Shas, Talmud, once or twice to get to feel the language well, and then you would know intuitively when something belongs and when it doesn't. But thank God, I mean, we don't have to invent the wheel. There are great scholars who wrote about that. Weiss Halivni wrote about that. Feldblum Professor Feldblum didn't publish much, but his students, his Talmidim, Pinhas, I forgot his name.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, Josh.
So you're saying, whether it really belongs, but we're recipients of a redacted text.
Yes.
What is the end goal of determining if something doesn't belong? Are we trying to filter out everything that's not halakha or related to halakha?
Of course. Yes.
In other words, it's already there, so it's hard for us to say it doesn't belong. It's there.
Right. No, the thing. Right. So when I say it doesn't belong, I mean depends on what is the nature of it. It's a good question. There are two things here. First of all, not all the text that is inserted into the Talmud is a legal discussion, and so sometimes it's just like this one, it sort of distract you from the main direction or from the essence of the sugya. The other thing is that if you attribute that text to the authors of the Talmud, right, to the authors of the original text, so to speak, so you believe that they have the authority to interpret and understand it as it is. But if it comes from an anonymous author who lived later and did not put his seal on it, how do I know that his interpretation is valid? I have to accept it. So if you come from the point of view of the scholar who says, okay, I want to analyze everything and I'm not taking anything for granted, it doesn't really matter if it's one of the Savoraim, Stamaim, or one of the original authors of the Talmud. But this, what I'm saying, even for those who would grant the sages of the Talmud greater authority, that would be a problem. I mean, they have to take into consideration that not everything comes from the original source of the Talmud. As a matter of fact, this already happened when Dr. Pinchas Hyman, that I told you, the student of Professor Feldblum, when he published the booklet called Shitat Revadim, the idea was to show the layers in the Talmud, and eventually they were able to publish, I think, at least one volume of Brachot with the Revadim built in. When you see in different colors the different times of each author of each text, which sheds light on the sugya, it helps you understand. Back to your question, what was the original law? Because if you see, for example, a certain law regarding Gittin, how they handle divorces, right? And the first time that there's a question or a doubt regarding that system is in the 5th century, then it's an indicator that up until the 5th century, that was okay. Nobody had a problem with it, even in Mishnaic and Talmudic times. So it's important to know the layers. So anyway, Rabbi Dr. Pinchas Hyman came with this method, and he showed it to several rabbis, including the chief rabbi of the time, Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu, and he approved of it. But shortly afterwards, there was an outcry from people within the Orthodox world, even the modern Orthodox world, who knew something about scholarship, and they reached out to Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu, and they said, no, this is impossible. Like they say, it borders on heresy, and they shut it down. They didn't allow the system to be taught in the official school system, unfortunately. But I'm not going to go not here into every sugya and analyze it in that manner, but it is of extreme importance when we talk about questions that have a halachic implication to our time and date. So I give you one example. That's something that I wrote about in length. Is the question of what is called hotzat zera lebatala, wasting one's seed. That is discussed in the Talmud as a prohibition, but not in the Mishnah. I mean, it seems if you follow the Talmudic interpretation of the Mishnah, it is in the Mishnah, but there's a different way. There's a way to understand it as whatever the Mishnah that is brought as a source is questionable. But the real problem is not who said what then, but rather the facts as we know them today. At the time of the Mishnah or the time of the Talmud, people believed that the man's seed is made up of many little human beings called homunculi or homunculus, and that wasting the seed is basically killing all these potential people. And now we know that it's not so. So the implication is not about just wasting one seed, but rather it has to do with questions of fertility treatments, or family planning. We don't see in the Orthodox community yet a campaign that addresses the issue of the size of the family and how to do it, whether to do it or not. It's sort of a given that family planning does not belong in the vocabulary of Orthodox Jews, and it is largely based on that interpretation. That is one example. That is an interpretation. I deliberately did not use other examples such as the idea that are based on scientific knowledge of the time, such as that babies who were born after 7 months of gestation, of pregnancy, are fully developed, whereas after 8 months they're not fully developed because they had a longer gestation period. This is something that's already mentioned in the Mishnah, and that is based on misleading scientific knowledge. But the issue of that I just mentioned is only appears in the Talmud. So when we have a concept that only appears in the Talmud, also what we just saw, what we just discussed, the idea of a woman whose hair is uncovered. The first time that the idea that an uncovered hair is a problem appears in the third or fourth century. So we always have to ask these questions like, where did it come from? So But I just wanted to talk briefly about the Talmud and move on to the next period. So, as I said, the Talmud is it is not a homogeneous work. It's hard to talk of the Talmud as one book because it is co-written by hundreds of authors, plus 200 years of work of anonymous authors that edited and omitted and changed without, and we don't have any way to track it. Also, even after people stopped adding officially text into the Talmud, they kept copying the manuscripts of the Talmud that they had, and as they copied it, they corrected, they added, they changed, not as editors of the sugya, but rather from their point of understanding, the way they understood what the sugya was, and that is a serious problem, because if someone decides to change the text, and we have no way to track it, we have no way to know what was the original text. The Geonic period, this is the period that we have more information from, and that's a period that not only we have literature, it's well documented, especially since the people of the Jews of Spain sent a letter to Rav Shirira Gaon asking him about the methodology of learning, how people studied at the time of the Mishnah, how they studied at the time of the Talmud, and he answered in a very detailed manner, including dates of the rabbis and the scholars and the format of learning. But even that letter was distorted over time, and we have two different versions. It's called the French version and the Spanish version, and the little differences between them are significant in trying to understand how exactly the Mishnah was redacted and how it was passed from generation to generation. It's another book that I would recommend reading. If you find that there's a scientific edition and translated, there are one which is produced by the Orthodox world, one which is critical, scientific, that it's worth looking into. However, the Gaonic period, which spread over between 600 to depends on how you look at it, but we could say that there were several Gaonim that were very active, who spent maybe 200-300 years. The Gaonim corresponded. They had correspondence with the whole Jewish world. They would get questions. They would send answers back, and they wrote monographs about certain halachot. Rav Saadia Gaon also wrote treatises of philosophy. They were very, very prolific in terms of literature, but there was no considered effort of writing all the sort of summary of all of Jewish law, except for one. It's called halachot gedolot or halachot psukot. I mean, that some say it's the same, some say it's different books, but the first one to sort of tackle the totality of halachic literature and try to provide a solution was Rabbi Yitzhak Alfasi, the Rif. What Rabbi Yitzhak Alfasi did, he basically rewrote the Talmud, omitting all the irrelevant parts. First of all, anything that was irrelevant to the Jews of the time, meaning the temple, sacrifices, leprosy, the laws of Kohanim, etc., he omitted. And he also trimmed the sugya to the essential. He took out the legends, the stories, the unnecessary discussion, and in a way, and there was a really a tremendous undertaking that I think. I mean, when I look back into my years in yeshiva and how the rabbis spoke about the Rishonim or the Haronim, I think that the role of the Rif is not appreciated enough. The Rif is looked at as a commentator. I mean, we would go, sometimes we studied the Sugya with some of the rabbis, those who taught in the Brisker or in the Litvak methodology would not usually do that, but other rabbis would. We would learn the discussion in the Talmud as it is, and then we'd go to the Rif, which is the abridged version. But we wouldn't dwell on the abridged version as he wrote it and ask why exactly did he omit this or add this, but rather we would look at his commentators, Rabbeinu Nisim of Gerona and Rabbi Yosef ben Haviva of Spain, and that was our focus, because this is how we were guided in the yeshiva. But the Rif was actually poised to become the substitute for Talmud. If things would have happened a little differently, probably today, instead of studying Talmud, everybody would have studied the Rif, or as it's called, Talmud Rav Ilfas, the abridged version of the Talmud by Rabbi Yitzhak Alfasi. Rabbi Yitzhak Alfasi he lived in North Africa and then he moved to Spain. They call him Alfasi after the city of Fez, but most probably he spent most of his life not in Fez but in another city, Qalat Hamad and Kirwan. But the interesting thing about the Rif, it was very opinionated, and he understood the role of the rabbi as the leader of the Jewish world. So, for example, when Rosh Hashanah would fall on Shabbat, the Rif would blow the shofar in his Beddin, because he said, "We are now, my Beddin is like the Beddin that was in Yavne after the destruction." He understood that the idea of blowing shofar on Shabbat is to serve as the spiritual center, and since his Beddin was the spiritual center of the Jews of his area of North Africa, they would blow shofar on Shabbat. I mean, this is the kind of halachic courage that we're missing today. Imagine an Orthodox rabbi today who would blow the shofar on Shabbat, right? What would be the outcome? How would that rabbi be treated in the Jewish world, in the Orthodox world? So, for a couple of hundreds of years after the Rif produced his abridged version, that was the preferred book of study in the Sephardi yeshivot, in the Spanish yeshivot. But eventually the Talmud came back. Why did it come back? It is hard to say. I mean, I think people loved the flair and the intrigue of the Talmud better than the abridged version. I mean, they wanted I would say, a wiggle room where, and you could see it until today, people in the yeshivot keep going back to the Talmud and the Maimonides and try to reconcile them, even though 90% of their discussions are completely abstract. There are books upon books produced on the fine details of the sacrifices in the temple and the way the Talmudic sages understood them, and they have no practical application whatsoever. Why is that? It is comfortable for people to be there in the realm of abstract thought that makes that doesn't make them obligated to anything. But in any way, I'll come back to it next class, and I hope we have more time to discuss in a longer session, and I hope also to go through the introduction of Maimonides to his Mishneh Torah. But I think that the reason that the Rif was pushed away and the Talmud came back is that I think it would be 6 generations after Maimonides, after the Rif. Maimonides, Rif, the 5th generation. Maimonides was the student of Rabbi Yosef ibn Megas, who was himself an indirect student of the Rif. So he continued his tradition. So and Maimonides took the idea of the Rif to a new height. What he did, instead of being like the Rif, who basically works behind the scenes and doesn't show himself, and he just cleans out of the Talmud everything that he thinks doesn't belong, Maimonides wrote everything from the beginning. He wrote his new halachot, in his new language, with the new format, not adhering to the format of the Talmud. He basically came officially to replace the Talmud. And that, I think, was the reason of the backlash. Had Maimonides not written his Mishneh Torah, it is possible that over time the Talmud would be pushed aside and people would stick with the Talmud of Rav Ilfas just because it would be more convenient to study the Talmud. But when Maimonides came and dropped this bomb saying, this is how we're going to learn from now on, don't open the Talmud, it is a book that is complicated and not easily understandable, and I will provide you with the book that you could use. Go from the Torah directly to my book. You need no other book in between. I think that is the backlash. People were shocked by this suggestion, and he actually achieved the opposite. He encouraged people to delve deeper into the Talmud and to make it their main focus of study. But we'll talk more about it, God willing, next time. I think we'll conclude here. And if you have questions, let's bring them up now.